everybody. Welcome to the Hello Road podcast, where we talk about unique and forgotten cars, road trips, travel, racing, writing, automotive journalism, and our current car adventures. My name is Ethan.
My name is Paul.
And today we're joined by automotive journalist, vehicle suspension guru, and former Miata owner. You're a former Miata owner, right?
Well, I still have one. It just doesn't run.
Okay. Well, you're a current Miata owner.
Thinking of a different Miata. This is the second one.
The second one. Okay, yes. Well, we're joined by Dan Edmunds, who I guess is sort of a Miata owner. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Nice. So, I guess we should probably just jump right in because
Sure.
I know you've got a lot of specialization in suspension and a lot of history in that area. But we can kind of talk about anything today. But I think that's probably the first thing that I'm kind of most excited to dig in a little bit, and I know that Paul is as well. So if you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit of your suspension knowledge with us today, that would be awesome. So
it all started. No. Unlike a lot of like a fair number of automotive journalists, I started out as a mechanical engineer.
Mm-hmm.
And I worked for the Toyota Technical Center all through the 90s.
Okay.
And specifically at the Arizona Proving Grounds, starting in 1993 when that opened. And worked there till 2000. And yeah, my job was, tuning suspensions, just like the name of my video channel.
Yes.
All alter egos online, suspension tuna.
Yeah.
That's kind of what I did for a living at Toyota. And then when they wanted me to move to Michigan and I didn't, I hopped on with Hyundai Technical Center, which was in Southern California, which is where I grew up and, wanted to get back to, and worked for them. And they built the proving grounds up in Mojave. And I was part of the effort to lay out some of the road surfaces so that we could do ride tuning there and all of that. And I did that for quite a bit before I got into journalism.
Okay. Yeah, and what kind of drew you to the suspension side of things? What was it about that kind of piqued your interest? Or is it one of those things where you kind of just fell into it?
No, I mean my dad built race cars for a living, and was kind of always around it.
Yeah.
And he was a chassis guy. He didn't really, most people would have an engine, and he built midgets and sprint cars and Super Vs, and even an Indy car called the Lightning. And so I was always involved going to the track. And yeah, he was a chassis guy. I just kind of picked it up. I went into mechanical engineering. My first job out of college was with the Department of Defense. And I started going to races with a buddy of mine who raced in the Rabbit Bilstein Cup, and he ran SECA races in San Diego and Willow Springs and Riverside even. Mm-hmm. And I started crewing for him, and then I started corner marshaling, which you've probably seen me at the Button Willow.
I'm sure you waved furiously waved black flags at me at some point.
I probably called you on video as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then let's see. So eventually I bought my own car. It was a Rabbit, and then I started tinkering with the suspension to prepare it for something called improved touring.
Mm-hmm.
And then did that for a while, and I started tweaking suspensions then. And the job with the Department of Defense, just wasn't my bag. I wanted to get back into cars, but of course, I really wasn't able to move back east because of certain allergies and things like that. So I really didn't want to. Opportunities on the West Coast, at least at that point, weren't very well defined. And eventually, I moved to showroom stock racing, where you can't tinker with your suspension, but you're still kind of playing with tire pressures and getting everything dialed in to a very fine degree, because you can't do much.
Yeah.
And then I ended up landing a job at Toyota, and it just kind of turned into my career. And I actually was able to use my SCCA racing in my resume to get that job.
Oh, nice.
That's cool.
So that actually, and so then in maybe the first 2 months, there's this little group meeting, and my boss was sitting with a stack of assignments, and he said, "So anyone here ever tow a trailer?" And I'm thinking, well, sure, I have a
Yep.
race car, I tow a trailer, and nobody else raised their hand. It was like one of those movies where they look for volunteers and everybody steps back and one guy's standing there by himself. Well, that was me. And so that was like, okay, Dan, you're on the T100 project and pickup
Ah,
trucks. So, I went into Toyota thinking I was going to work on Supra and the MR2, and I did do a little bit of that. But yeah, I got on trucks early, and I'm thinking, oh, okay, well, I hadn't really been much of an off-roader at that point, and I'd only ever used trucks for towing. I had a big dually 454 and 80-gallon tanks and a fifth-wheel car hauler. It was a
yep.
big rig, but yeah, I got into it, and then it's like, hey, this off-road stuff's kind of fun, and of course, Toyota's pretty serious about it. The way they, really kind of treat it
Yeah.
as something more than just a four-wheel drive package. Like that's why Tacomas are so popular today
Yeah.
with that car,
Sure.
because they kind of walk the walk there. And I was in the middle of that, and yeah, one of my first big jobs there was tuning the suspension and developing the very first TRD off-road package for the Tacoma.
Oh,
Oh,
sweet.
That
cool.
was,
That's
that
awesome.
was Yeah, and it was weird because none of us knew that TRD was going to be involved. Uh, I was just tuning shocks and springs and asked for a tire, and then we developed a tire with BFG, and somebody put the diff lock in it, and then a TRD sticker appeared at the end. And my boss
Yeah.
joked, he goes, "Wow, it must stand for that's really Dan."
Oh,
That's
So it was
awesome.
really weird because nobody knew that TRD was going to be part of it. Now, since then, TRD's been brought into it more, especially
Yep.
with the pros. But the
right.
TRD off-road package is still kind of an in-house thing, whereas the TRD Pro actually has more TRD in it.
Got it. Okay. So
But
Paul,
yeah,
That's cool.
you got a ton of questions about suspension because you're a little bit more well versed than I am. I'm kind of like, duh, I guess this connects the wheel to the car in some fashion,
Yeah, I mean, I do have a lot of questions, but this, I mean, just Dan, hearing like the backstory, this is you lived the life I wanted to live, like out of high school and stuff, like going and doing all this. I was like, I've kind of always, I've always loved cars, but I know about engines, okay, but I've always loved suspension. It's always been my thing,
mhm,
but it's always kind of been this. There's so much math and geometry and numbers
yeah,
and stuff, and it kind of it's a little daunting, and in physics and all these other things. It's so cool because it's just like anything else on a car, it's all science, and so it just
right.
intrigues me so much. And I think that throughout the years I've done my fair share of experimenting with a lot of different things, and it's been a lot of fun, but I've got some questions. i need I need help, and I think Ethan needs some help, and I think a lot of our listeners need help with some things, so
Well, I mean, that's a good point. I mean, I think like what types of things. I mean, maybe you're going to ask this kind of the same question, Paul. And maybe we can kind of dive into this together. But I always sort of think like, what types of things do you think a car enthusiast should know about suspension? Like I think there's a lot of our listeners and like ourselves included. We like spirited back row drives. I have a Lemons car with terrible suspension that just leans in the corners and doesn't make any sense. So, what things
Well,
like
it looks good.
yeah, well, I don't even know about that. Yeah, well, what types of things do you think people like us should learn about suspension?
Well, I mean, I'm gonna kind of expand the give it a little mission creep here because I kind of consider the tires part of
Mm,
the suspension system.
yep,
And
sure.
tires are extremely important. Whenever there's a tire war in any racing series, suddenly the speeds go way up as the two tire companies are battling it out. And as soon as
yep,
Right.
there's not, then you don't see that as much. But certainly
Sure.
tires are the easiest way to just add a couple seconds a lap. I
hmm
mean, if you get the right tires, and but beyond that, I mean, it's pretty complex, but it's pretty simple. I mean, you want to keep the tires on the ground. You want to limit your unsprung mass, so you don't want to go too big on the wheels, uh, unless you really have to. I think a little
Sure.
sidewall goes a long way. I'm not, of course, I came through showroom stock, so I'm not afraid of a little body roll
Mm-hmm.
and a little bit of softness because roads aren't billiard table smooth like racetracks.
Yeah.
And so the
Right.
stiffer and lower and less sidewall you have, the more you're kind of restricting it to just the track. But if it's for roads, you kind of the suspension needs to breathe a little bit. You need to keep the wheels on the ground. So shocks are always important because they help do that. And you can go too low, you can have too little sidewall, and you can have too much roll stiffness. And I think people tend to maybe think that more of all of that is better, and maybe it's not.
Mm-hmm.
And and off road as well. You can the bigger the tire, the bigger the wheel, the more mass there is to control, and the less easy it is to keep the wheels on the ground, which is where they need to be.
Yeah.
And
Right.
and so it's amazing to me how detailed the development process is, so that the bushings and the tires and the springs and the valving and the shock done at the factory is all meant to work together. And if you change something later on, it's not necessarily tuned and balanced to work together. So,
Yep.
people, you read a lot of things in forums. Well, people will buy this such and such a shock and put it on the car, and maybe they won't like the results. Well, maybe, spring and the tire and all the rest of it aren't really matched together. So it's a little bit of a black art to get it all to work. And getting inside a
Sure.
shock and those little tiny washers that are inside, uh, there's some real subtle differences that make a
Huh.
difference.
Yeah.
So
Interesting.
it's complicated, but it's hard to like simulate it and calculate it. There's a lot of seat of the pants
Sure.
in
Totally.
suspension. So yeah, it's really an interesting topic, and the shocks that are out there on like the Raptor or the Bronco, they're way more sophisticated than anything I ever had to play
Mm-hmm.
with. And there's just so much there that I've never actually played with because it got so many more knobs, in a position sensitive valve with end stop control. And, there's just a lot, then you add adaptive or, valving to that. And there's some pretty sophisticated stuff on OE vehicles these days that
Yeah.
pretty impressive.
Yeah. Some crazy stuff on there. Like you said, the Raptor is just a great example. And then the what did they announce with the Bronco Raptor or what are people calling it?
The Braptor.
The Raptor that has those like crazy, like, is it Fox shocks on it, and it's just
Yeah, I
like,
think it's very similar to what the Raptor F-150 has, but
mhm,
retuned, and it's got a different spring setup in the back and different length control arms. But yeah, it's the same sort of damping. Pretty trick.
yeah, it's crazy trick stuff. And I guess that's kind of like where I was going to lead it into. Like for me, and I know for a lot of people that are like kind of getting their toes wet with like just doing track days and stuff, um, a lot of people will go and just buy a set of coilovers and throw it on their car, and they're like, okay, I got 2 seconds a lap because I put coilovers on, but it sucks on the street. Like in my
Mm-hmm.
case, I like to go with like a shock absorber, like a good shock absorber and a decent pair of or set of lowering springs, and that usually is content. I'm content enough with something like that. In terms of upsetting the balance that the engineers put into the car, is that something that is, I mean, in the industry kind of like frowned upon because I'm just some kid, from
No,
Southern California throwing these parts on
no,
my
no,
car to go drive.
no, no.
What,
I think every car is built to a certain target, and the target is usually a fairly you know, average person who
sure.
isn't going to push it too hard and wants some decent ride comfort and is a little bit worried about noise. and doesn't want to spend a lot when the tires need replacing. And
Right.
so, there's definitely, I mean, I used to race a CRX and a Civic Si and a GT. Those were all showroom stock, but certainly, just putting tires on those just woke them up. But then you
Right.
start to
Oh
say,
yeah.
okay, now I've got all this grip, and now it rolls even more than it did before because it's sticking
Sure.
so much better. And so then you have to kind of like think about, well, what's next? Is that springs and dampers? I usually like to source the springs and dampers as a set rather than go it alone, where you pick a spring from over here and a damper from over here. If you can find setups that are tuned, but coilovers can be really noisy. I know
Sure.
I put coilovers on a car that got extremely noisy because the springs just kind of rubbed on the collars, and and they're not all like that, but certainly I know I've been to SEMA in the past and seen like a brand of shock absorber that like everybody thought was really cool, and it was aluminum and had threaded body, but the valve inside it was like this crappy valve that I had inside the Toyota Sienna. It was made by Gabriel. Really crappy valve, but it looked good. So that's kind of the
Sure.
problem with buying aftermarket. If you don't buy like a real known name brand, you don't know
Right.
exactly what you're getting. And the stuff that matters is hidden inside.
Sure.
So,
Sure. Like I've had experience with Bilsteins on my Mini Cooper I used to have. I had some Bilstein Sports on it, and then I currently am using Coney. They're orange, the SRT Street, I guess they call it, on my Honda Fit, and I find them to be really, really good. But it always like makes me wonder, like they're cheap. Like the shocks are really cheap, and it's like, what's inside of it? But it feels better than a stock shock for sure to me. But it's like, and I always think about it, and I mean, unfortunately, and this is something I'm going to kind of get into in a little bit. But like with my car, there's not a whole lot out there that I can buy to improve it because the car is not necessarily one of the darlings of the racetrack. It's just
yeah, yeah, yeah.
my stupid ass racing a Honda or driving a Honda Fit on the racetrack. So, but like it's always one of those things you think about. Like you see some lower cost, suspension or coilovers or something like that. Is that something that is for just a good, we'll nip it in the bud right now. Just stay away from things like that, right? Or can they be good? I mean,
I think there's certain name brands that if they're actually tuning the setup for that car, uh, and it's not like they're. I mean, I tend to like Bilstein products. I think they tend to tune things the way I like to tune them. I also like the fact that they're monotube shocks instead of
mhm.
twin tube shocks because I think that you get better performance and more heat transfer through the body. But there are other brands that are good too, and it really is for example, you have a Fit, right?
Yeah.
There, yeah, well, there was a B spec series, and there's probably some stuff that was developed for that that's probably pretty decent. I actually raced a Honda Fit in the 25 hour back when
Oh,
B spec was being proposed, and
Hmm.
that car hauled the mail.
Yeah.
It was a
yeah,
second generation Fit, not the first.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
And actually, I
Mine's
drove with Simon Pagino in that car. I have you know, he came in the last stint. I
so
never
cool.
saw.
Oh, that is so cool. Okay, cool. Yeah, I was just kind of thinking about that, like, cause I have it's a constant thing for me, always thinking about suspension, what I'm gonna be doing next, and things like that. And there's this allure of these coilovers that are out there that are like, oh, it's like $800, and it's this company, and you're like, I don't know if I want to spend all that money and for these things to just suck or for them to break. It's just one of those things. So
Yeah.
you know that's something that just from the expert themselves himself, we stay away from those. We want to go something name brand like Bill. You think suspension? You
Well,
think Bill
they're
Stein,
not they're not
Coney?
the only they're not the only game in town, but I mean, they're definitely um, known throughout the world. It's not just a local thing or something that is kind of popular, I guess. There's certain brands, especially on the off-road world, where people buy them and they seem to be really popular. But I don't know that they're that much better than stuff that's, less than half the price. Like, I've been thinking about a setup for my 4Runner, and it's, Bilstein has a 6112, 5160 front and rear, 60 millimeter front, 46 rear with piggyback. That is like, that whole setup is just over $1,000. And there are people that are putting, $4,000 or $5,000 worth of stuff.
Sure.
Yeah.
And I don't think they're getting 5 times the suspension. But it's cool, and the sticker looks great on your car.
Yes.
Yeah, that sticker. It's all I spent $4,000 for a sticker.
I think if it's a brand that does actual factory tuning for cars that are for sale, then that shows a competence that carries over to their aftermarket stuff.
Yeah,
and if it's a brand that Ford or Jeep or somebody like that will use, then generally the aftermarket versions of the stuff they make, they can take it to another level, but they've kind of got that foundation of, they're trusted, they have a certain amount of quality control, and they're able to, work within the bounds of a street vehicle. If you're going full race, it's a different story.
That's a great way to think about it. Just if the OEM manufacturers use it, then it's good. And you see vehicles, Mitsubishi Evos that were installed with Bilstein, and you see, I know some of those Ford SVO Mustangs came with Coney shocks from the factory all those years ago, and so I think that's like a really good way to look at it versus like BC racing and Killer Bee suspension.
I'm not going to single anybody out because there's no way I've driven everybody's setups. It's just these are just broad strokes here.
And you might luck out. You might luck out with somebody's kind of off-brand setup too, maybe.
Well, there's some brands I haven't heard of that are like very well known in England. And I was just talking to a BMW person, and they asked me about this specific brand of suspension, and I hadn't heard them, but I looked them up, and they had a pretty good track record in the UK and Germany, and they have a lot of kind of engineering tests, I guess, to get things certified. And so some of that stuff can be pretty good, but you may not see it here.
Yeah,
sure.
Yeah. So I have got a question regarding your YouTube channel. You go through a bunch of new car suspension setups and kind of give a really deep dive of the suspension setups, which I think is very unique. I don't know of many other people that do that.
I haven't seen any. So cool.
And what can you let's give you a shout out? What's the name of the channel again?
You can look it up, Dan Edmunds, but also Suspension Tuna.
So there you go. Okay, yes.
So, because I have this vision for a T-shirt that I haven't made yet. That you can see a hint of it in my icon for that channel. But also, there was an REO Speedwagon cover that said you can tune a piano, but you can't tune a fish. And there's a tuning fork stuck in a fish's mouth. Well, I got to get a big delicious bass and stick a Bilstein in its mouth.
Yep. There you go. So out of all of the suspension setups that you've seen over the years, from new cars, old cars, I guess, is there anything that you just thought was awful from the factory? Anything that you thought like this is just a bad design? It should be improved.
It's bad.
Yeah. And you don't have to call it anyone in particular if you don't want to, but I'm just curious.
Well, they won't mind. There's one that was bad, just objectively bad. And that was the Coda electric vehicle's rear suspension. And I can't remember the specific horror story back there, but it was pretty off-putting.
Okay.
I didn't do a suspension deep. The suspension deep dives happened. It grew out of Inside Line.
From
that
Edmunds.
old Edmunds performance channel that they closed. And there was a long-term test blog, and there's like 15 cars in there, and you were expected to to post a blog every couple of days. Well, a car's there for a year and you got 20 people writing these things. And about halfway through, you kind of run out of ideas.
Sure.
And so one day I had the Fit. So Paul, we're getting back to a Fit here, first generation.
Yeah.
And I needed to rotate the tires. I thought, okay, I'll rotate the tires and make a blog post out of that. So while the tires were off, because I took the jack in the middle race style and jacked up both sides at once. And I took pictures of the suspension and made a blog out of that. And people were like, oh, that's so awesome. And, the commenters on Inside Line were there were a lot of people that just went in there just to be contrarian and whine about things. And no matter what you said, if it wasn't their brand of car, they were going to give you grief. And there was, a lot of that, not very many positive. And as soon as the suspension thing went out, that just stopped. There were just, everybody's like way more comments, all positive, lots of questions. Why don't you put arrows on it? I don't know what you're talking about. And it went from 4 pictures to 6 pictures with the arrows. And I think now it's up to 20. I probably did 100 of them in print for Inside Line. And then at some point when they closed it, they asked me not to do them anymore. And so when I left Edmunds just after, COVID, just before COVID started, I didn't know if I was going to be able to just get press cars from people.
Sure.
So I just did my own 4Runner because it has KDSS and I owned it. So I just did that and pitched it to Autoblog and they bit. And then I probably done 30 of them for them over the last 2 years.
Yeah.
And then at some point people were, saying, well, why don't you do a video? And, if they had asked me 5 years ago, I would have said, no way. I was terrified to do video. But in the last 2 or 3 years I was at Edmunds, they put me on camera a lot. I worked with Carlos Lago a lot, went to first drives and did all that stuff and worked with producers and learned how to string a task cam the right way. And so I just started doing that with my iPhone, this iPhone 11 here.
Yep.
And a task cam and a pretty crappy tripod, and I just went off to the races. And I started doing video walkarounds, and then, the ramp, the Flex Index ramp. I branded it Flex Index just because, I don't know why not. But that was something I built when I was at Edmunds because we got a Jeep 2-door Sport, and it was going to be a project vehicle, and we were going to mod it up and lift it and put bigger tires on it. And I wanted to measure how the suspension articulation changed with each successive change. And so that's why that ramp exists. And I wanted to buy one. I couldn't find anybody to buy one. So I just designed it, bought the steel at Industrial Metal Supply, hauled it back in my wife's minivan to somebody at work knew somebody with a welder and would weld it together for a case of beer or something. And maybe we paid him $40 or something. But then, it was at Edmunds in a locker and nobody knew what to do with it. And I just said, can I have it back, please? And after a couple of weeks, they said, yeah, because, they'd paid for the steel, but I'd done all the work.
Yeah.
And so then it showed up. And that's actually get more views than the suspension deep dives.
Yeah. I mean, they're pretty cool.
Totally. I think a lot of it is, the thumbnails. It's like it's all twisted and everybody's like, oh, I got to watch that. That's genius marketing right there.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's like, and it's a really important, data point for going off road. You got to keep the wheels on the ground, and
exactly.
You can have electronic nannies for traction aids, but it's better to have the tire on the ground because there's no delay there. And the more articulation you can get for a given vehicle, the better off you are. The less you'll have to use your locker or your electronic aids, and it looks cool too.
Yes.
It does. Looks really cool. Well, the videos are really awesome. Like, to all the all of our listeners and viewers out there, you got to definitely check out his channel because it's just,
Thanks.
You don't see that. You just lift up the car, take the wheels off, and there you go. And it's not something you see on any other YouTube channel, everybody's like, oh yeah, it drives good. It's whatever. But this is like, nope. I specifically watched the Civic Type R one, and I was like, I didn't know it had that crazy like axis.
Yeah.
That's a
That
really
was so.
cool.
I was like, I didn't know that about the car. I knew it had all, obviously the motor and all this other stuff, but I didn't know Honda had gone to like that far of lengths with the front
really
suspension.
did.
I was like, so cool.
And the thing is you can read a story about that. Somebody can write about it, but they may not, really get that message across. And
it's difficult to write. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I know. And even though I write about suspension a lot, it's still hard to get, visual aids. This is
beautiful.
Why I did that. And, the thing is I asked Honda, I said, hey, can I have some parts? Because it'd be, it's all, I'd like to be able to show it off the car too. And they stepped up and sent me parts in a box, and I sent them back, and they're on somebody's car now. But they also sent me this stuff from a regular Civic to do the comparison to see how it would normally be. So yeah, that was really awesome that they were able to help me out with that. And but yeah, I think it's something that I wanted to show people because it's cool. And I think that's the whole appeal is a lot of times I'm seeing it for the first time, and and there's always something interesting. And I want to circle back to the worst car.
Okay.
Because I think I didn't get into the one that I really wanted to talk about.
Oh, juicy stuff. Now we're getting into it. All right. Let's
I don't know if worst. Well, you can be the judge. It's the Kia Rondo.
Oh, I remember that car. Yep.
Yeah.
That kind of
If you
weird
ever
wagon.
have a chance to stick your head under the back of one, I recommend you do, because it'll look like the suspension bolts to the gas tank. Because it kind of does.
What the hell?
There's a subframe, and you know how the rear subframe mounts with 4 bushings, right? Well, 2 bushings are at the back, and the other 2 are at the front of the gas tank. There's like a perimeter frame around the gas tank that includes the rear cross member, and it looks like the stabilizer bar bolts into the gas tank. It doesn't, but it looks like it.
Looks like it. Okay.
It's the weirdest thing. And we had one in the long-term fleet, but I hadn't started doing suspension walkarounds yet, and so I never did it.
Do you think that's one of the weirdest setups you've seen?
It's pretty weird. I think the Clarity is pretty weird too, because the Clarity has this really odd rear suspension that's made to go around a hydrogen tank. But I think they still use it even if you have a plug-in hybrid that doesn't have the hydrogen tank. I think they just reuse the same pieces.
Interesting.
Yeah.
But it's bizarre. But I haven't ever done one because I don't know. I just don't see views with the Clarity.
No.
But
I'm not sure they see sales with the Clarity either, so that might be.
But but you mentioned new car. Everything's pretty much a new car because it's hard to get used cars out of. You can't really get a used car out of a press fleet. So I kind of focus on new just because they're the ones you can get pretty readily.
Right.
Sure. Well, speaking of extremely fast Hondas, we should transition to a very slow Daihatsus. I know you had some questions about your Daihatsu, Paul. I don't know how many Daihatsu suspensions you've looked at, Dan, but
not necessarily. Not necessarily about the Daihatsus. Like,
sure.
The question I had was kind of so. I mean, Ethan and I are kind of really active in like the Radwood scene and some of these cars from the 80s and 90s, and something that as the owner of a Daihatsu Charade myself, and Ethan has his fine fleet of vehicles that I'm sure there's a few of them out there. There's a few of them out there that if you were to go look up like a shock absorber or a strut for the car, there's none. They have stopped production on them. You cannot replace this part on the car. I deal with that with my Daihatsu, but my question is what would be the next logical step? If you can't buy the part, nobody makes it anymore, or they do, but you don't want to spend $500 to ship it from Australia or something. What would you do in that situation? Is this something where like you can take some measurements and maybe do like a strut insert, or maybe find something comparable? What would you do in this situation for like, I don't know. What let me think. What's your weirdest car you have, Ethan?
I don't know. The Stanza
Oh,
wagon was
yeah.
probably, but I sold that.
Yeah.
But they probably didn't have shocks for it. Like if you need, like,
Yeah, I don't think they
this
did.
is so. What would you do in this situation, Dan? What would you do?
Sell the
There's
car.
not a good
Sell the car.
There's junkyards. There's buying a parts car, which people do.
Yeah.
Is there a different model that that's from a different generation that uses the same parts? Is there a badge engineered clone that was sold somewhere else? I'm not a Daihatsu charade
Well, really?
aficionado, so
You're
I
not?
can't really answer that one. But all I know is that Edmunds bought a Yugo once. I don't know if you remember this.
Yeah.
We bought it in Boise, Idaho, and we brought it back, drove it down north to south through the loneliest part of Nevada.
Yep.
We brought a trailer in case it broke down and just gathered it.
Of course.
So then we got it back, and I'm thinking, well, this thing's pretty old. I should replace the timing belt. So I bought a timing belt, and I got the cover off, and I'm about to start the job. And then I noticed the date code on the timing belt was older. The new one was older than the date code on the vehicle.
Oh,
it was a 10-year-old new timing belt. So at that point, I just said, I'm not changing it. So, I don't know what that has to do with your question, but sometimes, even when you can find parts, they might not be worth using. But
yeah, that's the thing I was also kind of wondering too. How often, like, I guess, do you know where the exact shocks and springs are used on a completely different manufacturer's car? How often might that happen where they're just kind of sharing?
Well, certainly the valving
Yeah.
can be the same because, Tokiko might bid on this car and this car and this car. And, the Daihatsu charade, right?
Yes.
Charade.
Yep.
God, I don't know what that would have been related to. But yeah, it's tough. This requires internet sleuthing.
Yes.
I'm not going to be able to come with an answer off the top of my head, but there's got to be somebody who's a fanboy out there who's got stuff or knows something.
I'm the only one, Dan. That's just me. I'm not
there
on
are
the island by myself.
very few charades left in the United States. Yes.
Well, I was thinking, I've seen in the past with things like I work with vintage BMWs, and something that they do there is they'll take strut housings from, let's say, a 2002 TII, and we'll open them up, and we'll actually be able to get like a cartridge that'll slide into place, and there's your new shock. I was thinking along the lines of, is there something like that where you just, what sort of measurements would you need to take to figure out something that's not relatively known? Not necessarily a Daihatsu charade, but like maybe you can't find shocks for a Cadillac Cimarron anymore, or struts for a Cadillac Cimarron, or Nova Twin Cam, things like that, where like there's got to be some sort of math where you can figure things out and then kind of figure out what would work, or is that kind of just
depends on the ends? I mean, for shock absorbers that have round eyes on the end, there are places that will sell you off the rack Carreras or whatever in a certain length, and so you need to know the collapse length and the maximum length, and you can approximate it there. You're not going to necessarily have the valving you would have had, and it may not work. Because it's not just a shock, just like it's not just a tire. The valving inside is pretty important. And as far as a cartridge for a strut, well, if they're not made for that car, cutting open a strut to pull the guts out and put in a cartridge, it's hard to know if you get the right length. So it's a question of what's the collapse length, what's the extended length, and what can you find that has the same dimensions. But figuring that out is not, it's easier to say than it is to do.
Sure
thing. Okay. Yeah, that was kind of I think about at the different Radwood shows and stuff. You see a lot of obscure cars that like either shouldn't be on the road anymore or like you just don't see. Like my charade is an example, but there's other weirdness out there that I just think all these people that are driving them. I'm like, well, what happens if this breaks? What are you going to do in this situation?
Well,
So
I ran into that myself. You mentioned the Miata that I had.
mhm.
I at one point acquired one of the three original 1989 Chicago Auto Show Miatas, VIN number 17, and I raced it
Wow.
for years as a showroom stock car. And I actually have the first win in a Miata, and that was the first Miata race car because I got a logbook.
Was it in
Yeah,
this car? This one? Okay.
that one, right.
Yeah.
And that car, and you can see I rallied it later. I bought some through the Mazda parts. Uh, there was I can't remember the name of it, but if you were a racer, you could buy Mazda parts at a discount. And so they had on one version of that car Bilsteins, and I knew the Bilstein guy, and we opened them up and revalved them, changed the length of the rod so it would be longer. To your point, that stuff's doable, but you got to have something to start with. And
Sure.
so the rally suspension, and I created my own rally suspension for that thing because it didn't exist. And
So cool.
things out of the iBach catalog, I had to make some adapters to make them fit, and it all worked out really well. But I had to pick the right spring rate based on the weight of the car, and had to approximate the valving based on, well, nobody was rallying a Miata, so what's the closest? And
Yeah.
we kind of cribbed off of the Ford. What is it? Ford Escort, the European Ford Escort that all the UK drive, and they had a valving for that. We adapted that to these shocks. But before that, when I was racing at showroom stock, I had raced, complete bone stock. If you see any of the asphalt pictures, they put it in Miata of the month 3 months in a row, and the other one talks about road racing. And so when I restored that car, which is where I was going with this, I wanted to restore it tires and all. Well, the tires, BF Goodrich Comp TAs that he used to run in that specific 14-inch size just weren't available. And because I had to run it on stock aluminum wheels. And so that car there that's in that front row of all the other ones is sitting on like 25-year-old tires that are like so cracked that I didn't even want to drive a lap around Laguna Seca with that. And for the 30th anniversary, Mazda brought it out because I donated it to them. It's in their museum. But they wanted me to run a parade lap and lead the whole thing. And so I had to borrow some wheels and tires off of somebody else at the event because the tires that I had were just like, I found them online and they held air, but barely. But they looked like in a static photograph, they were the right tire. So, but yeah, I can't get that tire back. They don't make 14-inch showroom stock tires anymore.
Yeah. Can you tell us
185, 60, 14,
Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you came into possession of that Miata? Because we've seen that Miata. I think if you're a Miata enthusiast, I think you've probably seen a picture of your old car.
Yeah, that one, back when I was running just showroom stock, I think at the time I was running a CRX. There's a guy I know named Jim Jordan. He worked for Mazda. I can't remember what department. It wasn't an obvious motorsports department, but he was a motorsports guy, and he'd always race. And then there was a guy named Beaver Theodosakis who owned Life's at Beach. And if you remember that, was popular for a minute in the 90s. And he was down in Carlsbad. And then there was a guy named Mark Stanton who his brother Craig Stanton races quite a bit. At the time, they were running a Sports Renault, which is now Sports Racer Ford,
Mm-hmm.
and Craig was the driver and Mark was the crew. And so Mark and Beaver and Jim and myself were going to run this car that Jim knew about that I'd never heard of, called a Miata. But he worked at Mazda. He knew all about it. And he thought he could get his hands on one. And so we were going to race it in a endurance series the next year, 1990. And so we got the car. I had the fifth wheel trailer with the aforementioned dually. And so I went up to Benicia to the training center to grab it. And I guess the red one and the blue one, because they're red and blue, went into the press fleet, and the journalists wrote all their articles about it. And the white one went to the training center so the mechanics could take it apart over and over again and learn how to work on a Miata.
Huh.
So I came to pick it up, not knowing what I was getting. and they only had red hardtops then. So it's a white car with a red hardtop. And they gave me that, and I hauled it away. We caged it almost immediately. And then ran it in a SCCA driver school, which was something people would do to get extra track time because there wasn't a lot of track days back then.
Okay.
And so you'd enter driver school as a student, but you really wouldn't be assigned an instructor. You'd just stay out of the student's way, basically, to get your track time. But we did that also so that tech would give it a logbook and stamp the cage and all that. And so that became the timestamp that qualifies it as the earliest Mazda Miata race car.
Yep.
Wow.
And so then promptly the deal fell apart for the endurance race. I can't remember exactly why. We parted ways, but the car was stored in my trailer. And but in 1990 it couldn't be run in showroom stock because back then cars had to be a full year old before they would classify it. So it wasn't eligible to race until 1991. So I brought it to Big Willow, 1991. Took like 3 seconds off the lap record with it because it was just a killer.
Yep.
And they promptly wanted to put it in the next higher class, and Mazda, fought tooth and nail to keep it in showroom stock C, and they were successful. And that was the first. I was the first one to run the car in the country. The people in Florida had a race the same weekend, but people had their Civics and Toyota FX16s, I think, from the year before, and they didn't run one because nobody knew what it would do. But I had it; it was caged, and
might as well run it.
And it was like, holy crap, this thing's fast. And drive, and my buddy Eric Morehouse had a MR2, and it just crushed it.
Wow.
And,
that is that's awesome.
And double wishbone suspension front and rear, really light, power plant frame, the best shifting transmission you can imagine. In terms of a manual and the clutch tuning and all that, the thing's really good.
Yep.
And people didn't know what to expect, and they kind of chuckled at it. Yeah, so that's what started that. And then, I ran it for 4 or 5 years and then moved to Phoenix and kind of got busy working at Toyota with a proving ground, and it sat and it wasn't competitive anymore because for some reason SCCA decided they didn't like that car at some point.
Yeah.
And they did a deal with Dodge to allow the Neon to have, remember the Neon ACR, American Club?
Yep. Oh, yeah.
Everything about that car went contrary to the SCCA's rules. It had special high strength hubs. It had a seat that didn't fold down. It had special alignment specs, which technically weren't allowed, but I think they just wrote a big ass check. And for some reason, the Sports Car Club of America wanted a little dorky sedan to beat a sports car because they didn't like the fact that it was, a Japanese Elan or whatever. I have no idea. I could never understand it. And it just pissed me off. And I just gave up and parked it.
Oh, man.
Wild.
And then
that's a hell of a history lesson.
It sat in my yard, and then I lived in Wickenburg, Arizona while I worked at the Toyota Proving Grounds. And my wife and I went to Prescott, Arizona for dinner one night. And on the way back down, we're going down this nice windy road that connects those two cities. And there's this clapped out Volvo 240 just going like the speed limit, which nobody did on that road. Certainly I didn't. And I couldn't understand why this, it had these big ass mud flaps. And then I come around a corner and there's this big SCCA banner and a radar gun. And it's like, oh, this is a transit stage of the Prescott Forest Rally.
Okay.
And I stumbled into, and this guy was trying not to get a speeding penalty.
Yes.
So I followed him down to the service park and started talking to people and found out that, because I didn't know, I thought, okay, well, there's this, and then there's a rally in Minnesota. It's like, that's way too much towing.
Yep.
But I found out there was a local club called the California Rally Series that piggybacked off that event and did 3 or 4 others, and they were going to have a first ever rallycross championship. And they had this one class that was 2-wheel drive called Performance Stock for vehicles with a Kelley Blue Book value of less than $5,000. And there was had to be less than 2 liters or whatever. And so I immediately thought of the Miata, and it was just underneath the dollar value. And so the only problem was it was a convertible, and the rally rules specifically prohibited convertibles.
Okay.
But I lobbied the SCCA because they had allowed it in showroom stock racing with a hard top and a cage and certain things. A bolt-on cage, the clamps had to be replaced with positive bolted attachments. And so I just said, hey, the other part of the club does this, and you would have thought that would be a slam dunk, but the rally side of the club and the pro side and the club racing side, they're all like different little kingdoms. But they did go along with it, and so I took it to NASA sponsored event of all things down at Holtville, which had been a racetrack that I had run with the San Diego region, but they were running a rallycross and a rally sprint there. A rally sprint being one stage you run over and over again. You don't need a navigator or a terror trip. And I won both of those events, and people had been laughing when I took it off the trailer because it was 100% stock. The only thing I'd done is get some rally tires, some 14-inch Michelin rally tires, put them on the same Daisy wheels, all the stickers, the stock shocks, the stock everything, and it just cleaned up.
Nice.
It was a world championship that year too. That's that little trophy right
there. Where is it?
The little, next to the rotor.
Nice.
Yeah.
Awesome.
So that car but eventually I was at that 25-hour race running kind of a stunt entry that Mazda did. They had 25 drivers in 25 hours. So I was one of the 25. Cool. I was supposed to follow Patrick Dempsey. He had other commitments, and so they shuffled the order around, and I came after, what's her name? Ran the Ford Probe. Lynn St. James, who's about 4'10". And so I'm 6'2". So the driver change seat accommodation was pretty interesting.
Yes.
When she got out.
Just like rolled up towels and like stuff to get closer to the seat.
I did my hour, and then I spent the rest of the night talking to Rick, who runs the Mazdas at Miata Raceway, which is now the Miata Reunion, Mazda Raceway. And so he was running the car for Mazda, and I started telling him the story about this car. He goes, "Oh, you got to restore it. You got to bring it. The 25th is coming up. The 20th anniversary is coming up." And so he twisted my arm, and I ended up restoring it and brought it to the 20th anniversary event, and then asked Mazda if they wanted to put it in the museum or something, because I couldn't title it. I couldn't drive it on the road. It had 6,000 miles on it. Hard miles.
Yep.
Only driven on the weekends. But I figured, they should have this, and they weren't that interested. And so Jeremy Barnes said, make it into a spec Miata. And I never was interested in spec Miata. I didn't want to spend all this money for 3 more horsepower to try to beat everybody else. If they had a sealed engine in spec Miata, I would have been there. But without that, I wasn't interested because I had to play that game with showroom stock. Pay Oscar Jackson a bunch of money to build you an engine to get 2.5 more horsepower than it had before he started. But you needed to do it.
Yes, you needed to do it to be competitive.
Yeah, so I didn't want to play that game. So anyhow, it sat in my yard for another 3 or 4 years. And then when the ND was coming out, he called and said, "Hey, you still interested in that?" And that's when it went on the road, and they took it to the Chicago Auto Show, 25 years after its first appearance. When the ND came out, it also went to SEMA. It's been all over the place.
Yep.
But it's in their basement garage now, so I don't have to deal with it.
It's not just going to sit in your yard for another 25 years.
No. But the thing is, the restoration process was a little involved because I have this other Miata that doesn't run right now.
Oh, yeah. So let's talk about that.
Back in the rally days, I was going to go from rallycross to a stage rally, but I needed a car I could title and insure. And this car couldn't be either one of those. So I bought this car off a cop. It had a blown up rear end, and I bought it for $850, and it has a hard top, but it's got 175,000 miles. So I pulled the engine out of the white car, the race car, which had 2 races on it. Put it in that car, and it was my daily until I got a job at Edmunds, and then just stopped driving anything but press cars. And at that point, it just kind of sat. And then Rick told me about restoring it for his event, and so I had to pull the motor back out and put it back in the race car.
No.
Ever since then, this red car sitting in the garage with no motor in it.
Yeah.
So
wild.
So yeah,
that's great.
That's way more information than you wanted, I'm sure.
No, that was amazing. That was so cool. There's so much history in just that 10 minutes that I never knew any of that, and it's super cool. So thank you very much for sharing that.
Sure.
That was awesome. If I could change gears, just a quick little thing.
Please.
This is a question I thought of that would be kind of interesting. So you've seen a lot of different suspensions on a lot of the newer cars and stuff. In your opinion, is there any more development that can be done to improve cars' suspensions going forward, especially into this like EV future we're going to be going into, where there might be, cars might be heavier? Is it going to be just, more stiffer dampers, or is there like some crazy weird new thing that some company's coming out with that's going to revolutionize the automotive suspension segment industry, whatever we want to call it?
Well, I think we're starting to see a lot of on the truck sides, actually, is where you're seeing most of the crazy suspension, the longer travel and position sensitive damping that isn't just, one damping rate, just depending on the speed, but also the position. That's pretty cool. But there's some pretty interesting stuff. I need to know the McLaren has had, and I think also the Rivian, and I think there was even a Infiniti QX56 that had hydraulic interconnected dampers that basically did roll control. And so the compression side of the shock on the driver's side is connected to the rebound side of the passenger side. So there's this kind of like hydraulic resistance to lean. And then you can put an accumulator in there, and you can play with electronics to vary it at different and the Rivian has that, and that's an outgrowth of something that McLaren's MP
MP4-12C.
Yeah, it's alphabet soup. So that's, I think the 720S has it as well. So that's a pretty cool system. It's frightfully expensive. And then there's, uh, I think just more attention's being paid to unsprung mass. We're seeing more use of dual pivots, dual ball joints at the outside, especially at the bottom, but sometimes at the top and bottom to optimize the steering axis. And that's just geometry. If you have one ball joint, that's where the pivot is. If you have two, you can kind of take an imaginary line from where those two can extend out into a virtual point where they would intersect. And that's where your pivot becomes. And that allows people to do all kinds of things with the scrub radius and torque steer that you couldn't do before. But it's all money. It's just the willingness to spend money on it and to use aluminum instead of steel to get the unsprung mass down, to spend more money on dampers and higher processing rates on the adaptive dampers and active stabilizer bars that can actually lean in and actually make a car lean the opposite way. I mean, there's a lot of cool stuff that's possible. It just comes down to money.
Right.
Electric cars, you got to worry about noise because you don't have engine noise to mask road noise and wind noise. So you have to be a lot more careful with all those noise sources because you don't have an engine to kind of drown it out.
Yep.
And so there's a lot of it.
Would that be something where like they could come up with like a tire that actually is a little noisy? I know people don't typically like noisy tires, but to help with that, the sound of the car's accelerating.
Road noise is actually something that people complain about pretty readily. Having worked for Toyota, it seemed like there were very, of course, the J.D. Power IQS survey is, where the customers give feedback. And it seems like it's hard to get, people may or may not complain about steering effort or on center field or the kinds of things that journalists talk about. And I certainly appreciate it. But they will complain about noise because everybody has ears. And so noise is a thing. And, it's not necessarily the elimination of noise. One of the NVH experts I've worked with in the past is, it's like blending the sources so that there's kind of a harmonic there and it's not dissonant. You can have noise as long as it strikes a good balance between all the sources. And so it doesn't stick out. If you can't identify a location that it comes from, it's easier to ignore.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So tire companies need to come up with tires that sing a song, I think, and then we'll be in business.
You gotta go to that road and
that's
land.
Right. That's the singing road. Awesome.
The singing road where they actually got the math of the music wrong, so it doesn't play it in the right notes. But yes.
Yeah.
So what vehicle do you have right now that you're working on a video with right now?
This is a Raptor right now.
Really? Okay.
And I just did a Raptor. My last video was a Raptor, but it was the Raptor with 37-inch tires. And this is a Raptor with 35-inch tires. So it's the same truck, but, with the Bronco and with the Raptor, if you get the really big tire option, they limit the suspension travel by an inch front and rear. And that affects how much it's going to flex on my ramp. So I am going to see what this difference is.
Interesting.
That's the
all right.
goal.
Coming soon to your YouTube channel. Sweet.
Right. Well, I don't know about soon. I'm slow in the end.
Yeah. I haven't made a new video in about a month, so I totally get it.
Yeah, and I've got people breathing down my neck for the 4Runner TRD Pro.
Oh yes.
That I shot and I haven't edited because I think I misplaced the audio files and I've recently found them. So sorry guys. I'll get to it.
Nice. So that's awesome.
Very cool.
We covered a lot of ground. I actually I was kind of curious what you're up to now. I wasn't sure if you had any new opportunities. I heard through the grapevine, actually just through you, that you might be moving to a new a new workplace. Is that something you can tell us about? Is this sort of like, are we dropping a bombshell here on the Hello Road podcast? Is this something?
I think this might be the first time I publicly admitted
Okay.
it. Yeah.
All right.
So for the last, I've been doing my videos and freelancing for Autoblog and Car Driver and The Drive and a couple of others over the last pandemic period. But at some point I needed, a full-time gig. So I'd been working for a company called AB Dynamics selling steering robots and ADAS testing targets.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're going to have your automatic emergency braking, you don't want to run into a real car to make sure it works. We have targets that do that. But, sales isn't quite my bag. And I've missed the writing part. I've been doing my videos and freelancing. And so I got the opportunity to work for Car and Driver. And I'm going to be working as the West Coast technical editor starting in just over a week.
Wow, that's exciting.
Wow.
I'm really stoked about this. Yeah, it's gonna be great.
Congratulations. That's awesome.
Congrats.
I'm looking forward to it. I can do it right here.
Yes, and I guess like a key question would be: are you going to continue to make these suspension videos on your channel as time allows?
I think I'll be able to do that. I'll still have my weekends.
Yes. Okay.
And I may have to do more used vehicles or personal, modified Monteros or whatever. I know some people that have wanted to bring their vehicles over and put them on their ramp. Maybe I'll just do more of that.
That sounds awesome.
Totally.
Yeah.
Cool. That's great.
But, certainly, I don't plan to stop, but I mean, obviously, I'm going to have priorities.
Yeah, exactly.
See how that balances out.
Yeah, totally. Awesome. Well, that's I don't know, Paul. Do you have any other questions regarding charade suspension? Because
no, I'm good on the charade stuff. No, I mean,
which car can we pick that he won't know anything about?
Yes. Yeah. Awesome. Well, thanks so much for joining us, Dan. It was really a pleasure talking with you, and a lot of great stories, and I'm sure our listeners are going to dig it. Can you tell where can everybody find you on social media if you want to share that?
Yeah. Basically, Suspension Tuna will get you YouTube, TikTok, which I still haven't figured out.
Yeah.
It can be 1,000 or it can be 15 million.
Yes.
I got a GT3 with the center lock wheels. And I got the big 6-foot torque wrench.
Yep.
And of course, I held it straight up because that's the TikTok format. And everybody's saying, you have to have it horizontal. I know, but this is how the TikTok format is. And of course, I happen to be wearing flip-flops and my foot shows up. So it's like, oh, you can't wear flip-flops when you use a torque wrench. And of course, that made it 15.8 million with everybody making fun of me. So fine. But there's that. And then Instagram is the same. The only thing is Twitter is Edmunds_test.
Yeah, and I actually had a question about that because you worked for Edmunds. I'm curious if how many people actually thought you were like the owner of Edmunds, or actually like because with that same last name with a Twitter handle with Edmunds_test. Yes,
I know. Well, the weird part is I actually have a dormant Suspension Tuna Twitter account that I can't log into because I don't remember.
Oh.
And if Twitter could size that up for me, I would love it. But I got to figure it out. And but that was weird. I did it, but I'm a test engineer. My name's Edmunds.
Yeah, it makes sense.
Right? And I'm actually in Edmunds, and Edmunds.com isn't, because that's a first name, Edmund apostrophe.
Oh, there you go. Yep.
They confiscate your apostrophes when you become a website. So,
yep.
There
you go.
What can I say?
All right, Paul, where can everybody find you, Paul?
You could find me at Instagram and Twitter at Paul's Finest Hour.
All right, you can find my crappy fleet of cars, youtube.com/HelloRoad, Mr. Ethan Tufts on Twitter and Instagram. And if you're enjoying this podcast, you could subscribe to our new YouTube podcast channel. If we get to 1,000 subscribers, we could start streaming these live, which is probably a terrible idea, but we're going to try it at some point. So Yes.
Great.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Dan. Hopefully
Thank you,
we'll
Dan.
have you on again soon.
Yeah, and if you happen to pick up a Rondo, let me know. I'll do a suspension detail.
Yes, I'm going to look for one now. Sweet. All right. Thanks so much.
All right,
Have a good one.
Take care.